On the coldest morning anyone in the Green Mountains could remember, when frost glittered on every twig like powdered glass, 3 bobcat cubs shouldered into the storm. They were scarcely larger than house cats, their paws plunging and vanishing in drifts, whiskers clotted with ice, their breaths burst in frantic white puffs. One limped badly, hind leg tucked and bloody, where a skidding car had clipped it on the ridge road. Each step wrung a small sound from its throat. The other 2 would not leave it, flanking it like quiet sentries, pressing their bodies against its trembling flank whenever the wind came hard. They had been wandering for hours. Snow hissed sideways and erased their tracks as soon as they made them. Their thin cries were swallowed by the roar. Some old tug hunger, memory of warmth, pulled them toward a faint rectangle in the white. A window the color of honey. Inside the cabin at Birch Ridge lived Eleanor Reed, 75, a widow with a silver braid she tied into a knot at her nape each morning. She had been a nurse in Brattleboro for decades, steady hands and gentle words, the sort of woman who could calm a room by walking into it. Her husband, Cal, had felled the trees that became this cabin, and she could still point out which beams had come from the lightning-struck maple at the edge of the meadow. The stove had a voice of its own, always murmuring in winter. Leonard had 2 children, Paul in Chicago, Leah in Portland, with calendars so full that their phone calls felt like weather, sometimes gentle, sometimes sudden, always beyond her control. Most days, she told herself the silence suited her, books, birdsong, the chores done in their season. Then wind would pry its cold fingers under the eaves and she would ache for voices. That morning, the storm rattled the shutters like a drum. Eleanor sat wrapped in an old green shawl, knitting by lamplight while the stove ticked contentment. She dozed and woke in loops until a sound threaded the wind too thin for branches, too purposeful for drifting ice. A scratch. Then a high, quavering cry. She set her needles down and stood. Her hips argued. She ignored them. At the door she lifted the latch. The storm slapped her full in the face. The world was a white wall. She squinted, blinking tears from the sting. Against the threshold, 3 shapes huddled in a small pile. For a heartbeat she saw neighborhood strays, someone's barn kittens, lost. Then the shapes lifted their heads, and she saw the tufted ears, candle gold eyes, soft stippling of spots along winter gray coats. Bobcats. Babies. The smallest dragged its leg and trembled so violently she could see the shiver run from shoulder to flank. The other 2 leaned into it, as if they understood that warmth could be borrowed, that courage could be shared. Common sense, also known as the voice of everyone who ever loved her, advised shutting the door. Eleanor felt it, the brief flare of fear. Wild is wild. She was alone. The fear could not outshout the sight of one cub trying to shield another with its thin body. Something old and stubborn in her answered that loyalty with its own. "All right," she murmured, as if answering a question. "All right, then." She bent, joints sparking protest, and scooped the cubs inside 2 at a time. They were astonishingly light, cold as river stones in March, soaked to the skin beneath their fur. She set them on a nest of towels by the stove and shut the door on the storm. The cabin warmed around them like cupped hands. The injured cub panted shallowly, dull-eyed. Eleanor fetched the enamel basin from beneath the sink and warmed water on the stove, then tore an old sheet into clean strips. Her hands remembered their work before her mind did, the way good hands do. She poured water over the wound and winced as pink spiraled across the bowl. "Easy," she said, voice low and steady. "Little one." She dabbed, cleaned. Bound, improvising a splint from a butter knife padded with cloth and taped in place. When the cub jerked, the 2 healthy ones pressed close, and Eleanor laid her palm briefly on each small head. "I've got you," she whispered, nonsense words threaded with lullabies her children had long outgrown. The cubs curled into the towels, steam rising faintly from their coats as the stove did its work. One lapped at the basin, another blinked at her in slow trust. The wounded cub's breath smoothed by degrees. Eleanor sat back on the braided rug and let relief wash over her so sharply it almost hurt. The house, for the first time in years, felt crowded in the sweetest way. The silence held not absence, but listening. Tiny breaths, the sleepy chuff of a kitten dream, the soft tick of claws against cloth. Eleanor smiled into the lamplight and felt as plainly as heat, something inside her thaw. The storm sealed them in. The next day, the world beyond the windows was a blank page with no words on it. Eleanor fed the stove, emptied the basin, sliced venison thin, and simmered it into a broth. The cubs sniffed, tasted, then tugged at her sleeve with kitten insistence whenever she was too slow. Their need made her laugh an unexpected sound in her own mouth. She portioned meat into thimble bites, and on a whim warmed a little milk and crumbled bread into it. The Bobcats accepted her recipes with skepticism, and then, decisively, with gusto. By evening, the injured cub could hobble on 3 legs, its bound paw tucked neat. The others flanked it wherever it tried to go, as if 2 small moons had appointed themselves to orbit a hurt planet. Eleanor told stories as she worked, the old ones she'd once told in a car's dark back seat to drowsy children foxes and trickster rabbits. A bear who wanted to learn to knit. The cub's ears flicked, eyes half-lidded. She pretended they understood because it pleased her to pretend. On the 4th night, the storm's voice changed. Beneath the drum of snow came a deeper sound, heavy steps breaking crust. Eleanor set down the ladle and moved to the window, breath fogging the glass. At the edge of the porch stood a shape as large as a Labrador and far more fluid. Muscles rippled under a coat rimed with frost. Eyes like 2 coins of winter's sun watched the doorway. The mother. Fear rose clean and bright, then steadied into caution. A mother defending her young would take a bullet and keep coming. Eleanor's hand found the door latch. Cubs woke as if a thread had been plucked inside them. They turned their faces to the wood and called high and urgent. To open meant one kind of risk. To keep shut meant another. Eleanor slid the latch. Snow rushed the room, glittering in the lamplight. The bobcat slipped inside in a low, precise crouch. She did not look at Eleanor. She moved as water moves, exactly where it intends. The cubs met her halfway, climbing her chest, pushing their faces into her ruff. A sound rose from the mother's throat that Eleanor felt as much as heard, a deep rolling purr, ancient and enormous, full of everything the wild has for its own. Eleanor's eyes stung. "There you are," she said softly, though the words were for everyone. The storm did not release them for 3 more days. They learned the shape of one another's presence without touching. Eleanor laid meat on a pie tin near the door and retreated to her chair, book open and unread. The mother watched her, unblinking, until Eleanor's gaze dropped in respectful acknowledgement. The first night the bobcat waited until the woman slept, then ate. The second night she ate as soon as the door closed. By the third, she ate while Eleanor sat in the lamplight and pretended to study knitting patterns she knew by heart. Between them lay 6 feet of braided rug and an understanding that grew like a fire banked right. Something passed, wordless and exact. Not trust, not yet, sealed with meat and careful stillness. On the morning the storm broke, the sky was a pale bowl and the world was a hush. Eleanor opened the door onto a brightness that made her squint. When she looked back, the pie tin was licked clean. The towels by the stove lay in a small tumble. The cubs were gone. So was the mother. In the yard, paw prints described a script that trailed into the trees. Eleanor stood on the porch in her boots and nightgown, shawl tight, breath feathering. Gratitude came so quickly, it was almost grief. "Go with grace," she said into the woods. A breeze rose, wrote the prints into blur, and the page was blank again.